got it. I have it. I have aircraft. I have aircraft.
That's something you're probably never going to hear unless you're an airline pilot or a pilot that's flying around with somebody. What that is the captain taking controls away from what I believe is the first officer that's flying in this situation. The only time that happens is if there's a situation where they feel or deem it necessary in the interest of safety to take the controls away. Now, what you're supposed to say is my controls. However, in the heat of everything that's going on, sometimes what happens is you're just trying to get words out of your mouth while you fly the plane. So that's something that got transmitted, I believe, on accident. We're going to hear the whole audio here in a second. But usually that only happens on landing for the most part. And it usually happens because they think something is going to happen or get worse than the condition that it's already in. And they want to stop it before it gets worse. Check this out.
Oh, Endeavor 4814, ILS 22.
Endeavor 4814, number 2, wind 2001, I got 2422, please land.
Middle land 22, Endeavor 4814.
I guess I should add, for context, this is happening at LaGuardia. It's not one of the easiest airports to land at because the runways are relatively short, and some of the approaches are strange, like this one. What the pilots do is they have to use visual cues on the ground to get around and get lined up with the runway. However, in this particular case, they're landing straight in on runway 22, and it's pretty simple, with the wind only 20 degrees off, gusting 24. Now that wind readout is according to tower. There are times where they give me a readout that doesn't match at all of what's going on, and sometimes because they're pulling wind from a different side of the airport that could be a couple miles away from where it is that I'm going to be landing at. There have been cases where I've landed and they said something like winds 150 at 5 knots, and we're running down the runway, and I look over and I see a windsock completely pegged out like this, meaning we had at least a 15-knot crosswind. In this case here though, they do have pretty strong winds, but they're right off of pretty much the nose, and unless you mismanage the energy of this aircraft, it should be a relatively normal landing. Let's see what they do.
Endeavor 4814, 1822, please land.
Affirmative, Endeavor 4814.
Yeah, Endeavor 4814, 1822, please land.
Hey, still clear to land 22, Endeavor 4814. I got it. I have it. I have aircraft. I have aircraft.
Endeavor 4814, runway heading 2000.
Runway heading 2000, Endeavor 4814.
Endeavor 4814, climb maintain 3000, you okay?
3000, Endeavor 4814, we're good.
Endeavor 4814, contact approach at 127.3, I'll see you on your way back.
273, Endeavor 4814.
In the previous clip, you heard they were already cleared to land, so when the controller cleared them to land again, the pilot sounded confused because he wanted to confirm what he was being told because he already got cleared to land, so you don't normally get a secondary landing clearance. Listen to this.
Endeavor 4814, 1822, please land.
Affirmative, Endeavor 4814.
Then you heard the part where he actually started talking about where he was taking the controls away from the other pilot that was flying. Now, in a Boeing aircraft, in my opinion, that's a little bit easier to accidentally do because the position of where there's a few different ways we can transmit. Some have a button up by your left hand or right hand, depending on what seat you're in. And then you also have something on the center pedestal that you can use. And then we also have a button on the back of the yoke. So it's easier. And I've seen it before in cases where somebody grabs the controls very aggressively that they accidentally transmit or accidentally do something with the transmission there. That is more common. However, on the CRJ, it's in a different spot. This button right here is actually what you use to transmit. You use your thumb and actually push in a direction to actually transmit what you want to say. So I'm guessing when this pilot grabbed the yoke really quickly, he at that same time, his thumb caught that button and just in the heat of everything, accidentally transmitted what he was saying to the other pilot. Now, taking the controls away from the other pilot isn't a very common occurrence. It's not something that you do very much once you get to the airlines. In flight school, a lot more common. Or if you have me as your first officer, then plan for it. But in the airlines, typically by this stage, taking the controls away is not very common. You all have had a significant amount of training and you should have a significant amount of experience. And so it's not a common thing that you'll see have happen. So when that happens, it's kind of a reflex. Something is happening that's causing the captain, I'm guessing in this case, to take controls away to stop something from getting worse. And then the controller obviously heard that transmission where they were taking the plane away and then saw them going up in the air, which is why they said this.
4814, climb maintain 3000, you okay?
So why did the captain take the controls away? Well, we're about to find out. Check this out.
Endeavor 4814, they're saying on the go, somebody saw some sparks from one of your wings. You guys feel anything?
We did, but we'll check it. Thanks, Endeavor 4814.
Endeavor 4814, hold 170 till Greco, contact LaGuardia Tower 1187.
170 to Greco over to Tower Endeavor 4814. Tower Endeavor 4814, ILS 22.
Endeavor 4814, Glad Tower, you are now number 2. Wind is 19017, class 31. Did the approach control give you the heads up when you did the missed approach over here?
Affirmative, Endeavor 4814.
Okay. You're clear to land on way 22.
Clear to land 22, Endeavor 4814.
Now this flight was happening at night, which in my opinion makes it easier to see the sparks. However, in the daytime it makes it easier to see the wing cranked all the way to the side, but probably not so sure about getting the sparks. However, at nighttime, as you can imagine, it's a little bit easier. Apparently it was the left wing that was struck. I wasn't there. Now they're landing on runway 22. The winds were 200, meaning 20 degrees off the front of the plane. So that means a plane wouldn't really have to be in that much of a crab. That's like less than 10 knots of a crosswind component. That's not a lot in the grand scheme for airline pilots. Crabbing is when the winds are really strong, so the plane is coming in at an angle here where the nose isn't directly facing to the runway, but the plane is actually tracking down the middle of the runway. And if you're ever a passenger on a really large aircraft on a really windy day and a pilot is taking that strategy, because there's a few different ways that you can do this, but if they're taking that strategy where they're coming in the crab there, it is possible that you'd be able to see your runway, which would be an unnerving thing because you're coming in sideways and you can feel when it's really windy, I'm talking 40, 50 knots of a crosswind component, the plane is going to be coming in at an angle and you're able to see depending on the type of aircraft you're on, and it would be a bit unnerving, even for me. But in this case, with only 20 degrees and the winds that what they're reporting, it's only about 10 knots that's coming from the left-hand side. Now what can happen is pilots can anticipate that what they think is going to happen and they start to dip that left wing down. There's a few different scenarios here, but one of them is you put the wing that has the wind coming from it dipped down. That's something that they teach in flight school. And that is a strategy of which you can get to the ground. However, what will happen in some cases is that you start anticipating that and you put that left wing down, in this particular case, too much. Now, most pilots learn to fly in a plane like this, or at least the poor pilots like me learn in these. And these high wing aircraft actually allow you to really put the wing down when you're coming in on a windy landing. However, when you try that exact same strategy on something like a 747, you're gonna hit the wing. So what happens is that some pilots, when they go through flight school, they'll develop these muscle memories of, hey, I'm gonna keep that wing down really low, and then I'm gonna come in and land on that left side, and then right side, and then the nose. And they will develop that strategy because instructors will teach that strategy. Of course, at this stage in my aviation career, I really think like every flight school that's training pilots that are gonna go to the airlines should have one like grumpy old retired captain that's there that flies with people every now and again, so they can see them developing these bad habits, give them an alternative option that will make them safer pilots when they get to the airlines. But I'm not making all the rules. I'm just thinking that would be, if I was looking for a flight school, I think having one of those guys would be around would be great, because they would be able to help you with, hey, that's fine, that's how you can get on the ground if you have to, but I wouldn't make that your go-to move where you keep that wing really low. I looked online because it's been a while since I've flown the CRJ 900, but it says after 10 degrees of bank, you start to risk actually having a wing strike, which is actually quite a lot of bank to have in on landing. Pilots at most airlines that are flying the CRJ 900 are also typically flying the CRJ 700. And what's kind of an interesting point is how you manage the energy of those two is almost identical to how you manage the energy on a 747. Meaning the 747 400 and the CRJ 700 are very similar, and then the 747-8 and the CRJ 900 are very similar. And they're similar in this particular way. If you take a CRJ 700 at 30 feet, you start to really pull the power back, you'll still come in and you can still have a very good landing. However, on a CRJ 900, if you chop that power back at 30 feet, your plane's gonna slam into the ground. It's the exact same thing for a -8. And for newer pilots, when I'm flying with them, newer to the 7.4, that's something that I mention as well, especially when it's on a windy day. Because in flight school, what a lot of pilots are taught is cross over the threshold, landing is assured, chop the power. And you'll chop the power and then you just kind of use that energy that you have and you just coast onto the runway. Or if you're me, you're pounded onto the runway. But either way, you're gonna land on the runway. But when you do that on a larger jet aircraft, like a CRJ 900 or a 747-8, you chop that power at 50 feet, you're really gonna hit it. But even at 30 feet, you're really gonna hit it. You have to slowly pull that power out and get that power out really just as the tire starts to touch down if you're looking to have a smooth landing. And the reason that starts to become a problem is because when you add the wing low and the energy management, and you combine those together on a windy day, you can have this particular problem. Imagine you're coming in at an angle where you're maybe 10 degrees of bank, which is safe, and you're coming at this 10 degrees of bank, and then you chop the power at 30 feet because that's your muscle memory, and because it's windy, you're doing what it is that you kind of rely back to in your training. As that plane hits the runway, what can end up happening is the left tire can end up hitting first, slapping that left wing on the ground, causing it to spark. And then you also have the risk in that particular scenario of actually having the right wing slam down even harder, and then you can have that right wing have a wing strike as well. There have been cases in the same with the 7-4, something similar happening where they slam down one side, and usually we don't have a wingtip strike, we have a pod strike, which is where our engines are. That's more common. We'll slam an engine down, which are pretty expensive, I don't know, about 25 mil or so. So you slam those engines on the ground, it gets expensive. And there have been cases where they slam the engines on one side on the ground, and then that has such a heavy momentum switch, it slams the engines on the other side. So it gets very expensive. Another possible scenario that I have personally done before is you don't have enough crab in on your plane and you're actually getting drifted to the side of the runway. So in this case, you're getting pushed to the right side of the runway. In order to try to get back to the center line, you're giving more bank than necessary to try to get yourself back to the middle so you can land in the middle of the runway, which is where you're supposed to be when you land. So you can be aggressively banking to try to do that. Forget about your wings because possibly you're newer to that plane, but you can forget about how low to the ground your wings are going to be compared to possibly your Cessna. And you can focus on getting to the middle of the runway more than your wings actually hitting the ground, and then have a combination of all of these things like the gust drops out, or you chop the power, or any one of these particular scenarios. Now, they said with air traffic control that it was on the go around. At what point was one flying and the other flying, and when did the control take place that the wing strike happened? I don't know. The airline will look into that, and they'll pull all the data, and they'll be able to sync up when the wing bank happened, and they'll be able to see on their computers, hey, this is when the wing hit here. They'll be able to check all of that stuff, and they'll be able to sync in with the cockpit voice recorder to hear what was being said, and they'll be able to just time sync all those. So they'll be able to say that, but it doesn't really matter in this particular situation. I believe, captain took control of the aircraft at some stage because it got unstable enough to where they felt this wasn't going to be very safe. And then they went back up in the air, and somewhere in that stage, the wing got struck. So here's the chatter from the fire department and airport ops about this as they come in.
Car 0, you? Yeah, it's subject aircraft show final.
Car 0, copy, subject aircraft show final.
LaGuardia, tower from Rescue 1.
Rescue 1.
Is that the subject aircraft on the runway?
A-firm.
Copy.
And 4814, you need any assistance?
Negative, 4814.
And 4814, ground point 7.
Ground point 7, 4814.
Now, I think it's worth noting that even though this plane had Delta pain and people said it was a Delta aircraft, it is not technically Delta. It's a subsidiary of Delta. Airlines, which I'm not going to get into all the details, but back in the day decided to use regional carriers, which they were going to pay less, and that would allow them to run their business model the way they want to run it, which I have my own thoughts and opinions on that, but it doesn't matter. In this particular case, it's going to have, it's a Delta airline. Delta owns that airline, but they're not technically Delta pilots. That whole conversation that's going on with the ops and stuff, you notice that at least I didn't hear at any point where they declared an emergency. However, the fire department was there and the airport ops were out there. And the reason they're going to be out there is because they saw the wing strike. So just as a precautionary measure, they're going to come out there and be out there just in case there's a problem. But what it lets you know is if you're a nervous flyer and you're looking at the wing and you're coming into land and you're looking out that window at your wing and sparkles start going off at the end of your wing, it's not the end of the world. These planes are so resilient, and even with slapping your wing into the ground, ripping something maybe off or changing the aerodynamics of that wing, even with all that going on, the plane was still able to, that they didn't even notice it, that they were able to come back around and land. So this kind of goes to show you just how resilient these planes are, that you can do that and have it all work out just fine. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.